this area of information is not always available or made available on the radio or on television.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's been sort of, I don't know how the whole program has been arranged, but just the fact that the music gets played in some kind of coherent fashion is it's been I feel privileged to have the opportunity to do that. It's not often that you hear things like this on the radio. I agree. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions about some historical questions about your past in music as well as your present and future.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, in your 1968 album, in the notes to that, to 3 Compositions of New Jazz, you mentioned that you saw a situation where Western values, not only in art but just in life in general, were slowly collapsing or even rapidly collapsing. And I'm wondering if you sort of have that same attitude today, and if it is reflected in your music today in different ways.
Well, I feel that the world is profoundly changing, and of course this viewpoint is hardly profound. More and more we are seeing the dynamic implications of accelerated technology, transportation, and the possibility to have global experiences. We find ourselves just before the 3rd millennium moving into a trans-temporal time state that gives the possibility to, for instance, on the radio, listen to Bach. At the same time, someone is driving by playing rap music, and upstairs, your sister or brother is practicing rock and roll, and we are influenced by trans idiomatic qualities. And I see this phenomena connected to the next time cycle, where cyberspace and extended computer possibilities will open up 3-dimensional experiences for our species as we begin to look at the challenge of creativity for the next time cycle. The understanding being that creativity is part of the energy of a culture, is part of the radiance of a culture, and is not simply some isolated activity that has nothing to do with cultural life and vibrational experiences. And so your question, well, I mean, it's quite a question, because in fact everything is changing, and for me as a student of music, I'm very excited about what some of these processes pose for the next time cycle. This is true even though at the same time we are, as a culture, going through a period of vibrational complexity, but I feel that underneath this time cycle, there is a positive unity that seeks to find a way to re-emerge. And I find myself more and more feeling that this time cycle is simply something that we have to go through individually, in groups, and as a species. But on the other side of this time cycle, that is in the 3rd millennia, there will be positive and fresh experiences for our species, and every reason to have hope. And so in some ways, for me, it goes back to that great American political activist, philosopher, minister, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who in the 60s and 70s coined the concept, keep hope alive. In fact, that phrase for me has a mystical importance as I seek to look for hope for myself as an individual, the hope that I can somehow evolve my work and my life in a way that will be consistent with something that makes some sense out of something. And the hope we as Americans have for our culture, in spite of our complaints, there's a lot of talent in our country, and we have much to be grateful for. We love to complain, but more and more, this has become a kind of a form of immaturity. It's time to set the agenda for the next time cycle, and either we will set it or other factors will set it. But the future is coming, and your question for me is a part of the challenge of the next time cycle, because everything is changing, and maybe, just maybe, it will call for, this change will call for a fresh understanding of individual dynamics and consciousness, of group dynamics and interactive experiences, and ritual and symbolic experiences. My hope would be, when I think of my music, is that my work will be relevant for the challenge of the challenges of the friendly experience, or quote unquote, in the next time cycle, because there is everything to do.
Okay, well, I'd like to seize on one of the things that you, and the many things that you've just said in this answer. You mentioned the development of new rituals in music. I am wondering about your music in particular, because with other groups that arose out of the AACM, like the Art Ensemble of Chicago, the ritualistic aspects of their music are made plain, I guess, with their their use of with face paint and use of ritual in their performance. Do you have a similar conception about your playing and about your groups, and has that developed over the years?
The genesis constructs of my music system, in the very beginning, pre-phase even, involved a respect for known qualities, unknown qualities, and intuition. And I have tried to build a music experience state, a thought construct that takes into account identity, the other, and the realm of hidden truths. For the music system that I have been working on for the last 30 years, the domain of hidden experiences and symbolic experiences has been expressed in the early language music strategies, which were strategies based on geometric sound contour constructs, time-space velocity constructs, as the beginning of existential exploration, in the sense of open improvisation, moving away from the vertical musics of the 60s. I sought in the early period to integrate the post-Eiler, post-Schoenberg-Stockhausen continuums of the music, because of my feeling that, that mutable identity structures that stable identity structures, that correspondence identity structures would be the primary components of of the new perceptual models of the next time cycles. And so in a composition like 113, hidden logics would be expressed in sound direction and body location strategies. Later, the coding of my music, the very coding of the title, would take into account known, unknown, and correspondence postulations. And identity in the very early musics would establish three zones of titling, of formular identity. Symbolic identity in terms of coded titles, and vibrational identities in terms of symbolic unifying intentions. And so the domain of hidden truths, even as that phenomena relates to architecture, would be a primary concern for the body of music I have sought to build. Later, as I found myself in the 60s reacting to the works, say, of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the middle period music, I'm thinking of Momente, for example, or the great works of Sun Ra, who in the 80s would, in the concerts at Central Park, for instance, would give us fresh concepts of spatial modeling, of fresh environments for creative experiences. The phenomena of hidden agendas in my music would seek to build a music that would be okay, let me find another one. I can't say that.
Compartmentalized?
Thank you. Thank you. Modular, even, where one composition could be placed inside of another composition, placed inside of another composition. A architectonic system that says origin identity is the identity that we normally associate with I'm writing a piece of music, that piece of music has an identity, would be just one component of structural identity in my system. The second component would be modular identity, taking the composition from one, putting it into something else. And the third aspect of that would be genetic identity. What constitutes genetic identity? Where one page of composition 96 is reinserted inside of another composition, or origin identity instrumentation can suddenly in the second house be performed by any instrumentation. What am I saying? A composition written for the classical orchestra, the bass part can be taken out, and that part can be played by 26 melodicas. Or it can be taken out again, and one page of it can be put into another composition where it will provide some connective identity experience. This way of modeling would establish a first domain of correspondences, where the concept of hidden domains in this context, would involve musicians who are moving through connecting inside of those spaces to single or group tours in a three-dimensional experience, where in a composition like 174 for 10 percussionists, constructed environment and tape, where the friendly experiencer can actually go up a mountain and inside of the experience be given the coordinates that can factor mapping experiences in a particular domain as it relates to the three-dimensional real-time model that I hope to build, that being a model that in this period I talk of as akin to Disneyland, where a Disneyland of sound, where people can come in, musicians or non-musicians, and have experiences, interactive experiences, individual experiences, group experiences, and on the third level, ritual and symbolic experiences. The concept, the subject of hidden agendas, again, would be a factor in my system. Hidden agendas or hidden domains in that context would be akin to a menu of experiences. Say, for instance, John and Sally decide, I'd like to have an experience for 3 weeks, and we'll start in New York City, 1 day in New York City, 3 days individual experiences. On the 4th day we meet in Chicago. On the 7th day we meet in Salt Lake City, and we end the experience in San Francisco. Something analogous to that, where there is a menu of experiences where the friendly experiencer can fulfill his or her agenda in terms of stopping off. Someone might want to go over to Kentucky to see a friend, or someone might want to meet another group and have another experiences. Inside of the experience, each individual will have particular magic numbers that relates only to their journey, symbolic structures that will be based upon hidden agenda variables, like, for instance, instinct, attraction, I'll say belief, but I don't mean two-dimensional belief. And so this is the kind of model that I am presently working on, and the subject of hidden agendas, hidden beliefs, has always been a component in the model I've been working on.
I'd like to pick on one of the aspects of the things that you've been talking about in regards to right now. Seems like you're working on a model for a system which could incorporate musicians and non-musicians. In your previous work, how comfortable are you with allowing the musicians that you work with free rein in terms of developing their own ideas, whether or not they happen to match with how your composition may have been conceived before you got to the recording situation or the performing situation?
Thank you for your question. Very good question, sir. Thank you. For me, your question refers to, I find myself thinking of the early arguments, freedom now, the arguments of improvisation as it relates to composition, and what constitutes experience. My position has been, as a composer, I wanted to have an architectonic state of music that came together, went apart, that would have a context of documentation and hence dialogue, and also that would allow for a surprise to come in from whatever plane that surprise came in on. It seemed to me then, in the early period, in the 60s, and I still feel that that is not for the composer to simply determine all the variables and as such limit the possibility of the interpreter or friendly experiencer. Now, I do not mean that I see improvisation as somehow more primary than composition. In fact, it's just the opposite. I would find for myself that open improvisation, has always been an important part of my work, or at least 1/3 of my work has been cast in the mutable postulation space, reacting to events and hoping to at some point understand myself and evolve my work. I feel that part of the dynamic implications of the post-Eiler musics would be the expanded domain that those musics would open up for the creative experiencer. By 1980, the neoclassicists would reject that and would again seek to re-emphasize idiomatic constructs based on music from 1900 to 1965 or something. I don't know. And I mention that only to say that I see that continuum as positive in some ways, and their insistence upon having the musicians learn their instruments and spend time learning harmony. I think all of that's important. I respect that. But your question is about the rights of the individual, as far as I'm concerned. And I feel that in a trans-idiomatic global planet state, that we have to be very important about how we define things. For instance, if swing is the quality, if the subject of swing is a consideration that can be used to define the parameters of the music, well, it gets kind of complex. I have never myself tried to disrespect the rhythmic, the internal rhythmic dynamics of the of the Genesis African American restructural music that started in New Orleans. Rather, I reacted against the narrow interpretations that have come about as a result of no disrespect, I'll just say a stylistic technocrat craftsman mindset. I have always felt that, the phenomena of swing, that is the, quote, internal life and dance from point to point, or from non-point to non-point, or from non-point to point, close bracket, is a phenomena that happens in every culture, that can be sensed in every music. And by that, I'm only saying, I hear a swing in Joey Will Morton, I hear a swing in Wojciech, I hear a swing in Clavierstück 6 of Stockhausen's, I hear a swing in the music of Bob Marley. And so, maybe some of these arguments are 19th and 20th century arguments about rhythmic logics, but maybe some of these arguments might not best characterize what we've learned about as a species through global information experiences in this time period. And that's why in the middle 60s, as I began to look for my model, my music model, then thinking I was interested in music, later I would discover music was just the beginning of it, would be I wanted the right to play my music with whatever feeling was honest for me, or even whatever feeling was dishonest for me. I didn't want someone telling me what I had to feel. I wanted, in my system, for every piece to be a fast piece, every piece to be a slow piece, or a medium piece. Composition 96, which is a totally notated piece, can be played in any tempo. All tempos in my system are relative, because in fact I would more and more find myself just looking at the use of constructs, perceptual constructs, interactive constructs, and symbolic constructs as energies for my model. And I felt as a young guy that an approach of that nature was valid, even though for many people, a guy like me was viewed as somehow separate from the scene, but that wasn't true. I was listening to the work of Eddie Harris. I have spent serious time studying the music of the great master Sonny Stitt and the American master J.T. Grice. It seemed to me that part of the inner rhythmic and vibrational life of their music hinted at a total fulfillment of the post-Parker vocabularies, and reflected upon not just one rhythmic model or vibrational model, but rather the significance of the individual experience and of individual affinity dynamics. What am I saying? I'm saying whoever you are, you have a right to your life, you have a right to how you feel, and that in my model, in the model that I'm seeking to build, it's not about me telling you how to feel. It's not about me telling you what to think in terms of religion. It's not about me talking to you about sex or about love or defining within that sacred zone that has nothing to do with some guy who thinks he has some idea for music or not music. I feel, for instance, that much of what we are seeing in this time period as far as what has become accepted as this is black is a very narrow interpretation of the affinity spectrum of the African American as well as the European American image and vibrational models, not to mention, for the most part, Asian and Hispanic American identities are rarely dealt with in our culture, but that's another whole subject. I felt that if a person can do the best that they can do, it should be respected. And I also felt that there is no one way. There can be no one way. Or at least the system I'm trying to build is not being built based on some notion that my way somehow represents anything better than anyone else. In fact, the primary axiom of my system is an agreement with a doctor, the great American scholar Ben Yakhanan, who in his books reminded us that the primary axiom of the thrust of the Genesis African cultures was the concept, man, know thyself. Man, woman, know thyself. The phenomenon of self-realization, and I'm not talking about perfection. I'm talking about the complexity of experience. And so it was never for me about agreeing with this idea that as an African American, I had to listen to and respond to only one sector of information, and that sector would be in the black community, and I would have to play the music and approach the music based on someone else's viewpoint of what I should do. In fact, that notion, that very notion, runs counter not only to the thrust of the trans-African restructural musics, but it runs counter to composite experience as it relates to our species. And so, to answer your question, well, the musicians in my ensemble, first of all, I'm glad they're there. With the kind of press I had, with the experiences of the last 20 years, I'm very fortunate that there are people interested to want to play my music, and I'm grateful that they're there. I ask for everyone to try to do their best, but I never talk about solo outside of a dominant solo, that is, someone will be taking a solo based on their relationship with themselves. I ask for people who, when the music starts, you got to do your best and not be angry at somebody and not try to use the music as a forum to pass any kind of negative energies, conscious negative energies, because the group is a family. The orchestra is a family, and it's hard enough to be on a planet. I ask the musicians that I play with to try to bring something positive. I mean, don't consciously be negative, and try to listen together and work together and have some fun. Play the music the best that you can play it, but also understand if we play the music totally correct, I'm not impressed. If we play the music almost correct, I'm not impressed. If we play the music totally wrong, I'm not impressed. But I am impressed that we're even there to have a chance to do it, and I ask my musicians to do their best. And off the record, I ask them, please forgive all the mistakes I'm going to make, because undoubtedly I make more mistakes in my own music than the musicians who play with me.
What about the process of rehearsals and just general? What is the laboratory for the creation of any one of your compositions? Is it mostly something that you is it something that you find needs repetition and practice to get down, or when you're having a group together, do you run them through some paces before they tackle the piece itself, or is it generally a one-take activity?
Well, I tend to rehearse not so much, and so I tend to need people who are interested in exploring notated materials or improvisational materials or different kinds of strategies. But by the time we get together to actually think about doing a concert or something, by the time I arrive at a point where particular musicians have been chosen for a project, we've already gone through having the experience of playing music together and getting some sense of how it feels. And after that, if a project comes up, I write the music. We generally have one rehearsal or two rehearsals, and then that's it. Unless it's some kind of orchestral project, but I think you're referring more to small ensemble chamber music groupings, say quartet to sextet. And the quartet to sextet project musics, I tend to look for ways to have efficient rehearsals, run through the notated material, and get as much as we can get from it, talk about the idea of the music, and for the first third of my experiences with the musicians, I teach them about my system, and then the next two-thirds of my experience, I tend to learn from them about how it expands and breathes. And so, but we don't rehearse the improvisations. I tend to, before the concert, give out the sequence of structures involving primary structures, that is, the primary compositions that will be positioned in time in a given performance. I'll indicate secondary experiences, that being trio, duo, inter-structural experiences. And I will also ask for each individual to bring one or two compositions for genetic experiences.
You mean for insertion into the larger one?
Yes, but I won't indicate where that genetic material should be used. And then from that point, after we have a particular order, then we just go out and play and see what happens.
Do you place a lot of emphasis or find it particularly important to have experience playing with a particular set of musicians, or to sort of know about their music before you play with them?
Well, good question, sir. I'll be 51 on the 4th of June, so I mean at 51, it's getting rough to keep up with the last couple of generations coming up. And so I rely more and more on my students to help me keep abreast of fresh winds and new musicians who I should learn about. But as I get older, and plus with the work here at Wesleyan University, it gets complex to keep up with the scene, nor am I that interested in the scene, or at least my interest has changed. I mean, as a young guy, I was interested in being in New York and hearing some of the musicians and finding out what was happening. But at 51, I am more interested in trying to do my own work, and so I rely on my students to help me to learn what's happening now. It's a hard one, though. It's a rough one. More and more, I find myself thinking, I will have to make an effort to maybe just start going down to the city. I don't want to get isolated in academia. At the same time, the time is going by so fast and there's so much to do. And so at present, I rely on my students, and I rely on my colleagues at the Tricentric Foundation, and I rely on old friends who might alert me to some of the younger musicians.
When you get together with some of the people who you've been playing with since the days in Chicago, do you have a sort of sense that the creative interaction is easier because of your years of experience together, or has some kind of depth or dimension to it that's not present in other interactions?
I must say, thank you for your questions. The level of your questions, I must say, it seems to me you must not be connected with any of the music magazines. You feel like a person who has spent some time thinking about some of these things. Your question is complex. In fact, I have been thinking a lot about your question, sir, because in fact, there is very little communication in a real way between the early members of the AACM. Oh, there's a lot of AACM hype, and everyone will dip into it on some level. But in fact, my experiences with the AACM took place between 1966 and 69. We're talking about 3 years. And even though many of us grew up together, since the 70s even, there has been no real communication between members of the AACM. Although, I guess that's not true. In New York, Muho, Richard Abrams, and Leroy Jenkins, and Amina Crowley Myers fought to keep the organization together. But the AACM has always been more complex than the wonderful imagery and documentation that's now forming. I feel privileged to have worked and known many of the men and women who came from that organization. And that period in time was most certainly profoundly important to me. But I would also say this. I had an experience with Music Electronica Viva that was important to me. I had the good fortune of, I'm very grateful for the AACM, but more and more, I find myself thinking it is moving. There's a element of hype that's slightly dangerous. In 100 years, I don't want the AACM talked of in the way that we now talk of the New Orleans music,
right.
Because as far as I'm concerned, the New Orleans musics were only one aspect of the profound fusions that would generate the composite American musics. I agree with the American master U.B. Blake that there were other areas equally as important. And I would also say that the great American fusion strategy musics did not only involve the encounter between the Africans and the Europeans. What about the Europeans and the Native Americans? It might take another 100 or 200 years before we can arrive at some concept, some notion of history that can make a little sense. But certainly the New Orleans experiences, as far as I'm concerned, has been played all out of proportion to reality.
I see. That's a very interesting comparison. A final question I'd like to ask you is about your daily sources of sort of new material and inspiration. Do they come from everywhere, from walking down the street, from all the sounds you hear, or are there more sort of laboratory-oriented ideas that you've been working on for a while that you generally tend to focus on?
Well, I, as a student of music, I'm in a wonderful position where I'm free to keep learning. And since coming to Wesleyan University, I am also taking classes. And I'm using the materials from those classes as part of the material pool that will make up the quad axiom writings, which I would like to have 1 or 2 volumes completed in the next couple of years. And so I have opportunities to continue to learn because, I mean, you don't stop wanting to learn just because you're 50. And plus, one of the things I learned from John Coltrane, Hildegard von Bingen, and Karlheinz Stockhausen, and the American master Harry Partch, was that you can keep evolving yourself and keep evolving your music with the right attitudes, and but you can't have fresh ideas unless you consider fresh postulates. And so yes, I at 51 years old, I can prove from 5 billion different theorems that, in effect, I know nothing. It's incredible. I can't believe how ignorant I feel in this period, because there's so many things happening. And yet, the experience of learning and considering new variables, well, that helps me in this period. And I would always like to be connected to a position of movement as opposed to a position of stability, although I'm not saying it very well. But anyway, no, I just finished reading the New York Times. So, I mean, there you have it. Of course I'm a masochist.
Well, Professor Anthony Braxton, thank you so much for taking the time to answer my question.